What I hope to cover today is actually several topics that you already mentioned, and they go, here it is. They go from, as you can see, from basically three topics. Global income inequality, a little bit about the inequality in the United States, and a little bit more about inequality in China. Zhuo was very kind to mention that study China. I've been actually studying China for a while, but obviously my knowledge is quite imperfect. So I would be very happy to, hear comments today. So these are the three topics that I would like to cover. I actually start with global inequality because, as you know, as many of you imagine, China plays a very important role in global inequality. But on top of that, there are changes in global inequality today which are unusual and actually which are really worthwhile emphasizing. Let me give you the background. First, global inequality is technically inequality between all citizens in the world. You would ask me later, and I will not go over that, how we have the data, because obviously the data from the past, from the 19th century, are very, fragmentary. But we do actually have data on GDP per capita. We have data on income distribution, not ideal data, but certainly something. So essentially, we can chart three different periods in global inequality, which again means inequality in income between all individuals in the world, technically. If you start with early 19th century, you see that inequality in terms of Gini index is pretty high, 55 Gini points, which is really quite high. It's like inequality in South Africa today or Brazil. But then you notice throughout the 19th century, it keeps on going up and up all the way to early 20th century. And then it stays at that very high level. And then finally, that's the most interesting part and the important part for us, is that actually starts going down in the beginning of the 21st century. Now, why did inequality chart the three different periods? The first one was really the period of the Industrial Revolution and what you can call the rise of the West. This is important because if you think of the world as really three parts, because they're the most important parts in terms of population, are the West, India, and China. What happened in the 19th century is the Western countries, basically Europe, but also North America, and then later Japan, became much richer, whereas China actually went even down, and India was stagnating. That created what is called the Great Divergence, and the very high increase of inequality. So you notice that increase of inequality going up throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century. Then we actually have very high inequality after World War II and the US dominant role in the world. The inequality is extremely high, but as you notice on that slide, it's not increasing. But then starts actually with the rise of China in the 1980s, inequality starts declining. And the reason is very simple, and I really would like everybody to understand that, is what happens with the rise of China and India a little bit later, is that these countries originally are relatively poor, and then they grow very fast. And this is something which technically, as you can see, almost arithmetically, is going to reduce inequality, because you have a very high income growth among people who are not very rich. And this is actually what is happening now. However, I will have to explain that actually in the most recent period, we have had some changes there, especially in change in China's role, but it will come in a minute. So differently, what I already said, actually, you can see the same slide. Actually, I'm now breaking the slide that I've shown you previously into two parts. One part which simply shows the total inequality if each country had full equality among itself, and the only inequality in the world would be inequality between countries. So this is the blue bar that you can see here. As you notice here, you have the rising inequality because in the 19th century, because of the increasing gaps between Western countries, and India and China on the other hand. And then you notice that in the 21st century, the opposite movement, reduced gap because of the rise of China and India. Also, you had during that first period an increased inequality within countries. Now that cannot be seen as maybe as clearly, but the orange bar gradually becomes bigger and bigger, indicating rising inequalities within countries. And then rising inequality within countries remains very high, at a very high peak in the 20th century, and still is actually significant today. So in other words, to some have a reduction in global inequality because of rise of India, China, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, most of very large Asian countries, whose rate of growth is higher than the rate of growth of the West. But within countries, you have very often rising inequality. And this is something that I would cover in the next part of the talk when I talk about China and the United States. Another way to see the rise of Asia, I actually here have a comparison in PPP dollars between China and the US on the left-hand side, and then India and Germany on the right-hand side. Of course, the scales are not the same, but of course you notice here that China in PPP terms around 2015 or 2016 becomes the largest economy in the world. And then you also notice, for example, large change in positions between India and Germany. In the 1960s, the two countries had more or less the same share of the global GDP. Then Germany's share went up and India's share went down. But since 1980, the opposite movement happens. Actually, India's share, similarly to China's share with respect to the US, is increasing. But I have to mention one interesting thing, which is quite important. China has been a major engine, the motor of the reduction of global inequality, for the reasons that I just explained. And then you see here from 1978 approximately, you notice that this slide shows the line, which is actually the solid line, which when it is below zero, shows the China's contribution to the reduction of global inequality. As you notice, that contribution is lasting all the years and is actually quite significant. But notice that at the end, that contribution becomes less. Now, the reason is not that the growth rate is less. The reason is that China has become an upper middle income country. So when you get to that point, you no longer, as I will actually show you here, actually in this slide, you no longer contribute to the reduction of global inequality. In other words, when the country becomes sufficiently rich, the effect on global inequality is being reduced. So for example, now, Chinese growth is neutral as far as global inequality is concerned. As China continues becoming richer and richer, as you can see here, for example, China's GDP per capita is now higher than the GDP per capita of 97 countries in the world, accounting for almost 60% of the world population. And as China becomes even richer, it would actually begin contributing to global inequality. So this is a very important point for many people because we are still used to saying, well, if China continues growing at 6%, it would actually reduce global inequality. It is no longer the case. It would, of course, reduce global poverty, but it is not going to reduce global inequality, which then has very important implications for global inequality. It means that countries in Africa and India become crucial for the reduction of global inequality. And I will not talk today more about that, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that while China has been the crucial engine of the reduction of global inequality for almost 40 years, the very fact that it has become now a sort of an upper middle income country or relatively wealthy country means that it is no longer that engine. And that engine now has to be India and has to be Africa, which is the only continent also whose population is rising now and will continue to rise in the next probably 50 years, if not more. So this is what I wanted to say about global inequality very briefly, because we are now at a very special point in global inequality. Very few people actually even know that, and it is very important to mention, especially because the evolution of different countries' GDPs as a result of COVID has been very different. As you know, India has had really two really very bad years in terms of growth. China, on the other hand, has had positive growth last year, and it would probably have a growth of 5 to 6% this year. So the gaps between these two countries are increasing. And this is, of course, the result of COVID, and we will see what will happen when the pandemic is over. So now let me just say a few things about inequality in the United States, and that's part of my book. And I will not go through all of this too long. And also, I would like to concentrate on the points which are also relevant for China, not only for the United States, but first I would actually cover them in the case of the United States. So the first point that I would cover is the rising importance of capital income in total income, and the fact that capital income is very concentrated. So again, that's something which I think should be intuitively obvious. What would be the effect? If you have one source of income, which is capital, that is very concentrated, and that source of income is increasing in importance, it is going to push overall inequality up. So I think it's relatively easy to see. If you had a source of income which is egalitarian and which is rising, then it would push inequality down. But if you have a source of income like capital, which is going up in size and is very unequal, then it would obviously push inequality up. So this is the first highlight of inequality in the United States, as you will see in a moment, also inequality in China. Secondly, a very important phenomenon, an interesting phenomenon which we observe, is that more and more people at the very top are not only rich in terms of capital income, but they are rich also in terms of labor income. This is something which, using Greek words, I have called homoploutia, which in Greek means equally wealthy. So some people at the top, and actually increasing percentage of people at the top, are now rich both because they have high wages, high labor income, and they have lots of their income from property. So this is a new phenomenon. You know, in a classical capitalism that, of course, one reads with David Ricardo and Karl Marx, you have capitalists who have income from capital, but they don't have income from labor. And you have workers who have income from work only. But nowadays, we have people who are both rich in terms of labor income and capital income. And finally, another element which will be also, I think, from what I've seen is present in China and is present in the US, and I will show you numbers in a minute, is that more and more people marry people who are very similar in terms of education or income to them. So that, of course, pushes inequality up. So let me then just simply concentrate on these 3 points in the case of the United States. First, as I mentioned, inequality of labor incomes is generally, actually always, lower than inequality of capital incomes. You see on that slide that US Gini, which is of course the measure of inequality which I already used, a US Gini for capital income is extremely high. It's 0.9, which is like almost as high as you can go. Labor income, however, has a Gini which is lower, which is around 0.45. So the rising share of capital income would push inequality up. On top of that, I'm sorry, it moved too fast. On top of that, you have the process of what I call homoploutia in the United States. And in this slide, it shows you the percentage of people who are in the top decile, which means that you take the richest 10% of people in the United States, and you say, what percentage of them are rich both in terms of their labor income and in terms of their capital income? And you notice here that this line goes up, saying that in the past, only 15% of such rich people were also rich in capital and labor income, and now almost a third of them are rich in both capital and labor income. Now, it has an implication that such people, of course, are much more resilient to the changes in the labor market because they have lots of capital income, and they're resilient to whatever happens to the stock to the stock market because they're people with high human capital. So you have a creation of a group of people, an elite, which is really quite resilient to changes in both labor market or stock market because they are rich in both terms of labor and capital. And finally, as I mentioned, the third element that I wanted to highlight is the rising percentage of people who marry, people who are equally educated or rich like they are. This is an example with the United States with a cohort of young men who actually, if you look at the slide, the orange line is percentage of young men who are rich marrying also rich women, and rich means in terms of labor income. So it's not actually that you have inherited income, that people who are very well educated and have high wages. And the blue line is percentage of people with high wages marrying women with low wages. You notice in the 1970s that the percentages were about the same. But today, the likelihood of a person, a man, who is actually very well, has high earnings, marrying a woman with high earnings is almost 30%, and marrying a woman with low earnings is only 11%. This ratio for women is even stronger. It's actually 5-to-1. So what has happened is that actually as more women have been in the educational system and they get very high paying jobs, they're actually also postponing their marriage and they're marrying partners who are also having high income. Now, this is all good because it obviously shows you freedom to marry whoever you want and the fact that actually you can decide to marry somebody after the educational system, after you have graduated. But it does, mathematically increase inequality because you have people of the same status, same wage, same education, marrying each other, and obviously people who are very highly educated and have high wages would actually by marrying each other would increase inequality. So the last point, which is also, I think, important for the US and also China, this is the example from the United States, is that the college attendance rates are directly proportional to the income of the parents. That means that essentially social mobility is lower. If you have the attendance of college, which depends whether your parents are rich or poor, then clearly the mobility between the people who are born to poorer parents and those who are born to richer parents would be reduced. So then let me go in the last part of my presentation, which will, as you will see, has actually many common points with what I showed about inequality in the US, say a few words about inequality in China. The most obvious fact, which is actually quite well known, is that if you put in one slide, I put here GDP per capita in China, this is the red line, and this is on the right-hand axis, and of course you notice that incredible increase, which is exponential. And on the other hand, you look at on the left-hand side is the Gini coefficient on the left axis, and you also notice a very high increase of inequality, which continues all the way to about 2010, and then starts going down and is basically flat. Now, we don't have, I think, as good numbers, as detailed numbers for the very recent years. I've actually here used the number that comes from the National Statistical Bureau for 2019, but you actually notice that inequality going down and then being sort of stable in the last several years. If you look at the urban and rural inequality, of course, in China too, you have, of course, large increase in urban inequality with the same tendency in the last 10 years to be about the same or slightly going down. And finally, you have the same tendency if you look at a different sorts of data. This is with micro data on wages, where of course private sector always has higher inequality in wages than the state. state sector, but you notice here too, in private and the state sector, you notice that the wage inequality has been stable, has not continued increasing since approximately the beginning, well, whether it is 2005 or maybe actually you can even see it here as 2007 or 10, but around that period. So you have sort of a confirming evidence from the overall inequality in China, from inequality between within urban and rural areas, and inequality within state and private sector of a sort of a stable inequality, but not decreasing inequality in the most recent years. And finally, let me conclude what I personally believe is that I think that actually we could define three solvable and three difficult inequalities in China. The three solvable inequalities to me are the following three. They're not easily solvable, but I think that one knows, and we know the cause of them, and we potentially know what is the solution. The first one is the share of Chinese inequality is due, it is quite well known, to inequalities between different provinces, the rich ones and the middle income ones and the poor ones, and the difference between rural and urban areas. Now, that geographical inequality accounts in China for almost a quarter of total inequality. Actually very similar to the European Union, which is 27 different countries, but lots of inequality in the European Union is geographical. Whereas, for example, in the United States, the geographical part of inequality is very small because the differences between mean incomes between richer states and poorer states are relatively small. So the first inequality, that difference in provincial incomes, which then feeds in the overall Chinese inequality, I think is potentially solvable through increased investments and higher GDP growth rate in Western or central provinces. And I think that's, of course, part of the government policy. And while it is not an easy solution, I think that the solution is kind of possible to envisage, and in that sense, it's solvable. The second one is rural and urban inequality, which also is a very large part of total inequality in China, but that could be also solved by easier movement of labor between rural and urban areas. And the third one, which is inequality due to corruption, which we see linked to the level of people's income, is also solvable through the anti-corruption policies. So these are, in my opinion, three solvable inequalities. I'm not saying that they're easy to solve, but I think they're technically solvable. I show here on the slides, but I don't have the time now to go through each of them separately, but I just wanted again to highlight the fact that, for example, in China, I compare here China, India, Russia, US, and the European Union. You see that China, if you take all the provincial mean incomes and put them together, they actually contribute quite a lot to total inequality. This is, you can see this 24.5 Gini points in China, very similar to the European Union 23.1 points, which I already mentioned before, and much higher than in the US, where that inequality is also accounting only for 4.8 points. So much more heterogeneous sort of differences in income in China and the European Union and Russia than in the US. Another one, which is interesting, this is from the official data that show the amount for people who have been sort of convicted of corruption, the amount of money they have been convicted of embezzlement, which increases with the level of administrative unit. Of course, you can assume that people who actually embezzled more were also people who had higher incomes to start with. So in that sense, corruption is adding to inequality. As I said before, the problem is identifiable and I think fundamentally solvable. The more difficult inequalities, and I will finish with that, are the following ones. The rising share of capital income, which comes generally with development and wealth. When countries become more developed and wealthy, the part of wealth goes up and the part of income which is derived from wealth is increasing. Now, that part of income, as I was saying before, is very heavily concentrated. and almost automatically leads to greater inequality. So the problem here is quite well defined, but it's not easy to solve unless the distribution of capital becomes much more equal, and that's not easily done. The second problem, which is, I think, important, and it's present in China as well, is the homoplutia, where you have people, as I was saying before, at the top who have high capital and labor income. Again, the problem is obvious, but the solution is much more difficult. And finally, the reduced social mobility if education is correlated with parental incomes. So let me show you the data from China, which come actually from different papers. You can, of course, see here the authors. This is not my work. It is actually the decreasing labor share in China, or the other way to put it, increasing share of capital income. And as I was saying before, the Gini of capital income, as you see here in China, is 0.8, and the Gini of labor income is 0.5. So the type of income which is more unequal is rising and pushing inequality up. As you see here, for example, from the micro data, you can see also that capital income is, of course, much more important for the rich people. You see here at the capital income at the top 1 percentile is many times higher. I cannot even calculate how many times higher than the income at the median. So the ratio between capital income at the top and the ratio and the capital income at the median is very high. Another, for homoplutia, this is entirely new result, which actually a co-author of mine just got very recently. Showing you here, the red dotted line is that percentage of people who are in the top decile in China, who are both rich in terms of wages and capital income. And you notice there the data go from 2003 and then 2013, I think, the last year for China. And you notice a very high increase, actually even higher increase than in the US, of people who are both sort of rich in labor income and capital income. And finally, we have also data about decreasing social mobility, where the study compared people born in different decades, people born in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and on the vertical axis is an index of social mobility, whereas on the horizontal axis is simply GDP per capita. So as you notice also here, interestingly, both China and the US show a decline in social mobility with the younger generations. And as I said before, these are, in my opinion, the three difficult issues that China needs to face in terms of inequality. Once again, the rising share of capital income, number one. The problem is clear, but the solution is difficult. The rising percentage of people who have high wages and high capital income, and the possibly declining social mobility among the young generation. So let me stop here and thank you for your attention. I'm sorry if I went a little bit too fast, but I just didn't want to take too much time. And I also wish to finish with all the slides. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the comments.
Thank you so much, Branko. Can you guys hear me? Branko, can you finish the sharing screen?
Oh yes, I'm sorry. Actually, stop sharing. Yes, okay. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Thanks so much, Branko. It's a wonderful talk. Obviously, a lot of materials. I mean, each graph there's a paper, academic paper behind it. So after the talk, I'll share with you guys some of the papers. It's actually on the Branko's website at the Stone Center. I'll share the link. You guys can go there, especially the paper about homoplutia. That's a fantastic paper about the labor income and capital income. Both basically the same person will have higher labor income and capital income. So that's a problem for social mobility. Okay, now we can get to the Professor D for the comments and any thoughts. something you want to share, then we can have a discussion. Okay, Professor D, it's your time.
Okay, thank you, Joshi. Thank you, Professor Branko Milanovic. It's really nice to have this opportunity to have this dialogue with you, and especially listen to your interesting and impressive speech. As Joshi has mentioned, your slides are very full of very interesting information. Here, I would like to keep myself very brief. First, some comments. There are a lot of interesting things in your slides. First of all, what impressed me most is that you mentioned in the past 40 years, China has been major engine of limiting the global inequality. So which is, of course, some common sense. But very interestingly, you mentioned that the future, that in the coming years, coming decades, China, if grows smoothly as the past, we are going to contribute more to the global inequality. So in the future, we have to rely more on nations like India or Africa countries or other South Asian countries to limit the global inequality. But here I would like to question this prediction, okay, a little bit. From my personal opinion, so you are right that China now reaches the middle, average global. The Chinese average GDP per capita, not in PPP, but in the according to the market exchange rate, is now happen to equal to the global average level. Yeah, so which means the richer Chinese is from now on, the more global inequality tends to be. But there are some other elements that China's role play in this game, because as you know, China is turning toward an capital provider. Yeah, more and more capital provider. Actually, in the past 30 years, we have already been a net capital contributor, but we saved a lot of money and put this money in the $1 trillion, at its peak, $4 trillion of foreign exchange reserves, around 60% in the US bills, US Treasury bills. Yeah, and then it's the Wall Street, it's Hong Kong investment bankers, it's London financial city who distribute this capital globally. But now, since 2013, and especially recently, China is changing marginally. Yeah, so we still save $3 trillion in the US Treasury bills and European bills. But marginally, we are putting more and more money into the project of the global, periphery, which called Belt and Road Initiative, I suppose Branko have heard about. So if Chinese could be successful in this new project, which we term as part of the efforts to build the 人类命运共同体, the human community with a common destiny. So if we succeed, which means if we are successful in providing more capital to the poorest nations in the global periphery, which has been omitted, which have been neglected by the Wall Street, by the London financial city, then the China's contribution to the global inequality would be continued. Reducing the global inequality could be continued, of course, in a different way. Before this year, we have been contributing to limiting this global inequality by developing ourselves. And in the future, we are going to make contributions to make the world an equal place, distributing in the long term, not a short-term profit-seeking projects, but in the long term, global development, which is more sustainable and more morally, I suppose it's a better solution. Yeah, that's the first point that I want to make. The second point, which interests me, is about the term that you used, which in Chinese we seldom see, homoplosia, yeah, homoplosia, which means that something have the same origin, yeah, or something share the same origin. The high capital income group and the high labor income group, they concentrate to the same person, same group of people. I suppose that's something that could be solved, but just now you mentioned it's almost impossible solution. We can hardly solve the problem, but I suppose we can have some solution on this, which means in the Chinese political economic system, according to your book, sorry, I did not read your whole book, but I do read some online book review about your book, Capitalism Alone. Sorry, I've got to interrupt a little bit. You believe that from now on, there's no alternative. Yeah, Tina, T-I-N-A. There's no alternative, but capitalism. Yeah, but you divide into two types of capitalism. One type is the American style resembled liberalism capitalism, but another is China resembles, which is China is typically described as what's the term? Political capitalism. Is that the term? Yeah. So, but from my terminology, we call it, the Chinese call it market economy with Chinese social, how to say, 中国特色社会主义市场经济新时代中国特色社会主义市场经济the market economy, socialist market economy with Chinese characteristic in the new era. Here I would like to elaborate a little bit how there's a lot of definitions or other definitions alongside the term. Yeah. So first of all, of the new era. Why it's called a new era? Because we believe before 2013, that was something old. Yeah, that was a period that China joined the globalization led by United States. But after 2013, a lot of things have been changed. Yeah, later on I will describe a little bit. Another term that here we use is socialism. So as I know, you came from Eastern Europe, yeah, Southeastern Europe. Yeah, that means you have experienced the European style socialism period. I don't know what's your impression about your childhood or young age living style. Definitely there are some merits, but there are also some shortcomings, obviously. Nowadays, China's socialism, we have been arguing a lot. In fact, in the past 70 years about what is capitalism, what is socialism. In China, according to Deng Xiaoping, we define market economy by stating that the capitalists could have market economy, so do socialists. The market economy is something good, could do something good, and it should not be monopolized by the capitalists. That's how we started opening up and reform, market-oriented reform. Today, in Chinese system, we have a very active, very powerful government, but at the same time, there are very active prosperity in the private sector, especially in manufacturing sector and the service industry. So back to topic of the homoplosia. I tend to, actually recently I'm cooperating with a friend, with a hedge fund manager, but also a thinker, about reform the global market economy, especially global political economic system in different states. It seems that we are converging. The whole world is converging, either Europe or China or United States. What kind of market economy should we practice? Or if in your own terminology, what kind of capitalism should we practice? Yeah. In fact, to my opinion, United States is zigzagging and now going toward a more socialist style, especially after earlier this year, as the left party, the Democrats came into power, and it seems President Biden administration, the Biden administration has been sort of kidnapped by its left wing, its own party. Yeah, they are just printing money, helicopter money, distributing wealth among the poor, among the colored people. So that's something. When I see this, I say, gosh, it's not capitalism. It's not even socialism. It's more reminiscent of the term communism. Is that right? So I don't know because recently I'm not interacting, intensely with American friends, but I don't know what the American friends, especially the right-wing people, people more pro the Republicans will think about this presidency. So they are just distributing wealth. And in China, we are also thinking about redistributing wealth. But the problem is, in the past 50 years or 70 years, European states have provided a model, yeah, or several models, which different from each other slightly, which is about welfare state. Yeah, but now it seems the welfare state has its cost because it discourages people from working hard, according to some of the theorists and observers. Yeah, it discourages people. So on the one hand, we do want to limit the inequality in one nation. But if you provide too much social welfare, it may result the enjoying life leisure of older people. Yeah, that's human beings. That means, from long-term speaking, the whole nation, the whole rich nation, will slow down its growth, slow down its improvement, progress in the competition among the nations. So how can we balance that kind of two costs and benefits? So our solution, my own suggestion together with my co-author, is that we should adjust a little bit about the social welfare system. On one hand, we should improve Chinese social welfare. Obviously, China, we call ourselves socialism, but we are still not socialism enough. Yeah? But we should build up our social welfare system in a very different way from the Europeans, which means, a lot of money from the public sector being wasted or being invested to save old people's life for extra 1 month or extra 1 year. It's very costly. So our suggestion is that the public sector's intervention in ordinary people's life and wealth distribution should be aimed at mitigate or minimize the inequality of, inequality among the young people, which means some young people was born in poor and stupid family. Yeah. The parents are poorly educated, and the parents have no capital, have no money, have less saving. They live miserable life. Being born into these families, it's not a fault of the people. It's not a choose. It's not a choice of the kid. It's not. They were chosen. They are not. It's not their choices. So, but for adults like us, people over 40 or 45 or 50, they should be responsible for their own behavior, for their own choices. So here's a balance. On the one hand, we should compensate for those young people born by a poor parents, by a poor and stupid parents. But at the same time, we should encourage individuals, encourage families to invest, to save, to be responsible for their own choices. So that's my suggestions. We should, on one hand, we should improve our social welfare system. On the other hand, we should decrease, limit the benefits that old people should get, and invest heavily into young people. This suggestion makes more sense, especially in the Chinese case, because maybe Branko have heard about. In the past 30 or 40 years, 30 years, we have been practicing a extra taxing system. Let's say invisible tax system, by printing more money than needed, and by get the land at a low price from the farmers and sell it cheaply, sell it very expensively to the market. So the result is a deprivation or exploitation among the generations. People my generation, I was born in 1970s. I benefited a lot from this game because I bought houses earlier than my peers. So the result is I got a lot of capital gains from what you mentioned, the increase of the capital gain. In United States case, it's mainly the ever rising, continuous rising of the stock market. In China's case, it's a similar curve of the real estate price manipulated by the government. So who is paying the cost? It's my son's generation. Yeah, it's my son's generation. It's young people who today join our Zoom talk. These people, they may be very talented, they may work very hard, they may go to very well education. Unfortunately, they can hardly, by themselves, they could hardly pay for a house, or not even house, just flat or apartment at a fair price. So that's, I call it transgenerational exploitation. So in China's case, we should compensate that kind of exploitation. Okay, so actually you mentioned a lot of interesting things. And finally, I'd like to, a final point that I want to make is about the concentration of the capital ownership. Yeah. Here I would like to mention something different, or according to my own perspective, own framework of understanding of today's world, something maybe more important is about the concentration of the ownership of data instead of capital. What is capital? Before 1971, capital means gold or something derived from gold. After 1971, gold is no longer currency. So capital means credit. Capital means credit created by the big governments. So after that, we have been witnessing the decrease of the scarcity of the capital, even in the whole world, especially after the 1980s, as China joined the US-led globalization. And after 1991, the Eastern Bloc dissolved and was absorbed by the globalization system. So then the whole world was absorbed into, evolved into a one system, capitalist system, globalization system. So since then, step by step, we have witnessing the growing saving rate of the whole world. Sorry, I did not make the, I did not have the data about this presumption. I suppose but from my personal impression, the scarcity of capital have been decreasing since 1980s. I don't know whether you agree with me or not on this point. So today, as the interest rate goes zero or even negative, that capital scarcity is diminishing or disappearing, especially at the center of the whole world system. Then what is more important? So in the agricultural society, I mean, before 1800, the whole world, the most important game is about the ownership of the land. After 1820s, gradually first from England, then Western Europe and the United States, and then Soviet Union, blah, blah. Gradually, the most important game is ownership of the capital. But today, land or capital are no longer that scale. The most important thing is data ownership. I believe today we are marching, the whole world is marching toward a new era. So, and we are witnessing different approaches in different systems in solving this data ownership problem. In the US's case, it seems that the big platforms, the Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, these big platforms, they own this data. And it seems it's not the stock owners of these big platforms. It's mainly the team who is running these platforms. They actually own these data globally. Think about the case of the former president, Mr. Donald Trump. His Twitter was shut down, and some other nation leaders of other developing countries, they could also be manipulated. Their Twitter account could also be manipulated. So these platforms are concentrating more and more wealth and power. In the past decade, we have witnessing the ever rising of the price, the bubble of, I should not call it a bubble, but because they are really making money. The ever rising, fast rising of the surge of the price of this fund, FANG fund, and these small companies affiliated to that. Now, the same case happens in China. China's political economic system, we are trying to find a solution, a balanced solution. On the one hand, we have to protect them and rely on them for the global competition. But at the same time, we have to limit them, restrict them, regulate them. Yeah? That's a recent effort that we are making. And the Europeans seems they have no platforms at all, which is very unfortunate. And if I'm right, they are more or less doomed in this global competition. And they are now trying to make some efforts to struggle to compensate for their they just lost a decade in this competition. Yeah. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you very much. These are my comments. And finally, I would like to sorry, okay, I will stop here. Then in the discussion, I would like to raise questions. Okay, thank you.
Is it my turn or?
Zuoxi.
Yes, it's your turn, Branko.
Okay,
Thanks,
brief. Well, thank you very much to Professor D for excellent comments. I really appreciate them. And I would try to go over the key comments without taking too much time. Just let me say briefly. First, let me take your comment number 2. I think I've made 5 different headings. Number 2, because I don't want terminology to influence things very much. my book is indeed called, as you said, Capitalism Alone, but I did not actually talk about that today because I'm fine with a different terminology. If one can say, actually, some people have mentioned that to me before, the terminology could be used, capitalist market economy and socialist market economy. It is fine with me, actually, as you said, sorry, as you said, actually, Deng Xiaoping was also talking about market economy and not with sort of it was capitalist or socialist. So, terminologically, I'm not, I would not argue much about that. I do actually agree with you, and that's also one of the parts of my book when I use the word TINA, because it is indeed true that the world is converging. So when we say there is no alternative, what we mean is that ideologically, people are not coming up with different ideas how to organize production than the way that we are doing it now, which is mostly by profit, by using wage labor, and by decentralized coordination. So we all agree, I think, that this is the main way that all countries are doing that in the world now. So that was the point number 2. But so let me go by, I just want to clarify this terminological issue that I don't really particularly stand by one terminology or another. But now, let me go to the number 1, which actually I'm very glad that you mentioned that it was about global inequality and the role of China. I didn't mention it in my talk, but I thought of this actually, but I forgot it. Indeed, the role of the Belt and Road Initiative could be precisely to accelerate growth in Africa, which, as I was saying, is absolutely crucial for the reduction in global inequality in the future. But technically, and when I calculate things from the country's point of view. So while China might contribute to the acceleration of growth in Africa, it would still, simply because we do the calculation by countries, it would simply add to global inequality in the future if it continues to grow at the rate that, of course, people project now, whether it is, as I said, 5, 6, or whatever percentage points, it would simply add to global inequality. And this is something which I think is inevitable when one becomes richer. If he continues becoming richer at a faster rate than somebody who is behind, he would contribute to inequality. So it is simply technical issue. Now, whether China would be successful in helping growth in Africa would be very important for the world, but of course this is an indirect effect and not a direct effect. But I agree with that point, actually, and I think it is true. It is simply that it still makes China, as it becomes a rich country, a richer country and eventually a rich country, would actually be a contributor to global inequality. Then let me just say a few words about what you mentioned about intergenerational inequality, which I think is quite important, and it's quite important again in many countries which face very similar issue with aging population. As you, of course, know much better, China faces that, the results of the new census are just out, and of course the population is getting older, and because it is bulky, lots of people would at a given year move into the older groups. Countries like Japan or Korea or countries in Europe, of course, face it is even more because they have a negative population growth rate, even in the US. So it is, I think, a global problem of the rich countries. It's not being faced by Africa, but it's faced by the rest of the world. And then this generational inequality is, as you know, quite present in the US as well. The previous generation benefited, and in Europe, benefited for high growth rates. They actually were able to save quite a lot. They have accumulated first wealth in the financial assets. They have actually become very skilled, high skilled, and have high wages. And the system that you mentioned, the welfare system, made sure that they get very high pensions when they retire. And for the young people, they have to start with really much worse starting position. Actually, obviously, they are now wealthier than they were, like their parents in the beginning, like 50 years ago, but their chances of improvement are much less. So this is, I think, a general problem, and I very much, I don't know more details about what you explained, but I very much agree that there is a generational aspect to inequality, which is not often brought out. And my final point is about capital. Now, I also agree on that point with you, but my perspective in the data that here is from the point of view of individual. So what I call capital income could be also called ownership income. In other words, I don't know where that capital income comes from. So it can come from ownership of assets. It can come from data, as you said. It could come from land. It could come from shares. It could come from rents. So it's really all of that together. Your point, of course, was more of a macro or maybe financial side to say that, of course, the dominant type of capital, which used to be land, and then became physical capital, or actually, as you said, became gold, to some extent until 1971, when the system of fixed exchange rates was stopped, that capital is now a very different type of capital. So I fully agree with that, but when I look at individual incomes, I simply notice that they have income from property. And that property can very well be actually property in data, property in platform, property in what is called intangible wealth, which is not wealth, like as you know, of course, as you said, it is not a wealth that actually we can touch, but this is the wealth that is very often, like we are talking now, it's a wealth that is Zoom or Facebook or Google or whatever. So as I said, I agree with that, but my capital income was not only income from the old-fashioned capital, it includes also the income from the new capital. And maybe final point, just to mention, when you said homoplatia, yes, it's an entirely new term, so nobody has been using it much. Actually, I invented the word in my book because I observed from the data that in the US, I started observing that more and more people have this double function of being rich sort of recipients of capital income and being also rich among wage earners. And then I looked at other countries. I showed you the data for China today as well, but then I looked at many other countries, and that percentage is rising. But what was also interesting, and that's my last point, is that countries which are more, how should I say, a little bit more closer to the old-fashioned capitalism, like Mexico and Brazil, have relatively small percentage of such people. And the reason is that very rich capitalists in Mexico are not often becoming, lawyers or software engineers or doctors. They are actually very happy being rich companies. But in a more advanced capitalist system, and that includes China, as you have seen in numbers, there is an increasing percentage of people who are both. I think this is all, except, yes, I wanted also to mention, that was the previous point about the generational issue. I think it's really a huge issue. And I think we see it also quite well in China when you mentioned, and I read actually daily Chinese papers, the issue of young people actually getting apartments and having really not having savings, and oftentimes, of course, having to depend on their parents to give them savings for that, and then postponing decision to have a family, postponing decision to have children. So all of that is very much linked together. And this is the issue that I mentioned at the very end, is the issue of social mobility, which is actually quite crucial. And it combines two features: social mobility with respect to your parents. As you said, there is no reason why somebody who was born to poor parents should actually not have the same access to education and everything else. And it's a generational inequality. So let me stop there. I think that I have covered, I think, all the major points from your comments. Thank you very much again for really being excellent comments.
Thank you very much for your explanation and coming back. So, Zuoxi, the floor is yours.
Okay, so that's a discussion part. Thanks, Professor D and Professor Branko Milanovic for the, I would say, exciting discussion. It's a lot of materials. We can even write a paper on that, about data inequality, about this generational inequality stuff. Then that's pretty much the main speakers part. Now we're gonna have the it's your turn. We're gonna have a Q&A session. Please, guys, you can ask questions by raise your hand in the Zoom, and we'll pick questions. Or you can, you feel shy, you can directly type in the message box. We'll ask you questions for you. Okay, it's your turn. Let me check the anybody.
You can also maybe read the questions to me, and I can answer them if.
Yeah, you can type it in the chat box. I'll read it for Branko. Yeah, anybody? There's somebody. I'll pick them. Okay. Okay.
Hello.
Yeah. So,
This is Ralph and Josie. Thanks for providing me this opportunity to ask questions. And Prof. Branko, thanks for your excellent speech about global inequality and income inequality within different countries, with the focus on the United States and China. You've mentioned systematic inequality in liberal or meritocratic capitalism, which is a systematic factor, a major contributing factor to inequality when the country becomes more capitalized. So my question is going to be, what makes China a different case from other countries in terms of inequality, or there's no differences? And as Prof. Chi has mentioned, in the case of China, it is socialist capitalism, or some other scholars call it state capitalism. I would say an economy system in which states plays a major role in economy activities and capital ownership. So if the inequality in China is an unique case different from other countries, how do these two different types of capitalism contribute to the differences? And this is my question. Thanks.
Well, this is an excellent question. I mean, obviously, George said we could actually write now a paper about that as well, actually, maybe a book. I would not go into all the details. I think that there are differences in some features of inequality in China and the United States. And these differences derive from two things. Derive from the difference in the level of development, which still is there, and derive from the difference in the economic and political system. But I also think that there are significant similarities. I mentioned, for example, going back to differences, I mentioned the big difference in the territorial or geographical aspects of inequality in China. That was quite well known that, of course, there are major differences between different provinces and rural and urban areas. But on the three difficult issues, and you know that I divided that into three solvable inequality problems and three difficult inequality problems. I think that it is more, to me, more similarity between the US and China than difference. The issue of high concentration of capital income is something which comes, and higher share of capital income is something which comes with greater wealth. And as I said before, it is solvable theoretically if one were to distribute it wealth much more broadly, but it's not very easily done. So in that sense, I think there is similarity. Homoplutia, as I said, also, it is, I think, in my opinion, similar. And this intergenerational inequality that Professor Jim mentioned, and the inequality in social mobility is also similar. So I would actually see more similarities than differences, but probably there are some other aspects where the differences may be more salient, more important than similarity. But as I said, I think I would see more similarity than difference.
Okay, the next question. You can open your video as well for the one who asked questions. Yeah. I think you can ask.
This morning. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Morning, Professor Milanovic and Professor D. I'm a big fan of both of you too. Thanks for the fantastic speaking you bring us this morning, and also the communication afterwards is very impressive. My name is Hansen, and I'm a postgraduate student from China. Maybe I'm not a very typical economic guy for today, because I do physics and silicon photonics. I did my master's degree in the UK, the University of Southampton. But from my own opinion, especially in my own area, the chips related industry, the fact that we have huge global inequality is also very big and heavy topic in all perspectives. So especially during the pandemic, I think everyone started to realize that the global economic is entering an unfamiliar territory. And even the post-pandemic boom may not be always be exciting for the right reasons as people expected before. So I remember in Professor Milanovic's slides, you've mentioned a series of very interesting data about the premise of the high concentration capitalism in the United States. And I think the high-end technologies must play a very important role in it. So as it is well known to be the most powerful increasing points of economic in the future will be heavily relied on it. And the past 3 years, I think many people have seen lots of related conflicts between the United States and Chinese government. Companies like Huawei draws lots of attention from this topic. So I think I want to ask my question, like, if even China couldn't break the barrier of the high-end technology from the capitalism and trying to cooperate it with the other companies worldwide, what should the other developing countries, like you've mentioned, maybe India or the African countries, what should they do to develop their own industry foundation in this area to reduce the global inequality? Many thanks.
Well, I have to say that, of course, it's really a great question, but it's a very difficult question, and I'm not really qualified to answer that. I can simply take the last part of your question when you mentioned development, and say that, of course, the higher rate of growth for many countries, especially in Africa, is really crucial for the reduction of global inequality. Now, global inequality seems a very abstract concept, but it is not. It is actually something which leads also to large migration flows. And that's why I believe, actually going back to Professor D's point of the importance of Chinese investments in Africa, I believe that Europe and China have an interest to collaborate in that, because with African growth, one can actually expect that many people would stay in Africa, and actually many African countries, they would not migrate to Europe. And as you know, Europe has problems with migration. So that's really a very concrete effect of global inequality, because when we speak of global inequality, it looks something very abstract and you cannot pinpoint. But in the case of migration, you can see. And then there is also the fact that if countries with high population growth, like many countries in Africa, which have 2 or 3% growth of population, need to have 5 or 6% growth on per capita basis, that means that they need to grow by 8% approximately per year. That rate of growth is very difficult to achieve. Africa, when it had a very good period before the financial crisis, grew at 3%, 3.5%, and that per capita, and that was very good. But going to 6% per capita is very difficult. And I do actually, as I was writing before, I'm a great supporter of Belt and Road Initiative because I believe that infrastructural developments in many of these countries are bottlenecks. There are bottlenecks also in ability to buy and sell goods between the countries. So in that sense, I think this is one of the, that's not the only way, but it's one of the ways of increasing development and reducing inequality. So this is all that I could say about, you know, growth. But of course, the question that you ask is much broader because it also includes technological developments, which are very difficult for countries that start with education level and with population that is fairly far in educational sense from the top countries. And I think that basically education is the solution there. But as you know, that it takes at least several generations. So when we talk about that being a solution, we really think about 50 years from now or even longer. That's quite a long time.
Okay, Professor D, do you want to share some thoughts on his question?
Sorry, I actually just now somebody called me to vote. That's why I missed a part of the important question. But after listening to Branko's reaction, feedback to that question, I would like to make a little bit, comment on what Branko said. Just now, Branko mentioned that the growth rate of the developing countries, the poor countries, yeah. So they should keep even faster growth rate to make them really progressive, yeah. So here I would remind everybody that in many developing countries, according to my own research, in many developing countries, also called periphery states, periphery economies, the number of growth rate itself, in most cases, are meaningless. Is because most of their currencies are always keep depreciating. You know, faster or slower, they're basically depreciating against the mainstream currencies like US dollars, euros, Japanese yen, or renminbi of China. So, for example, if we look at the case of India, before the coronavirus pandemic, the Indian growth rate have been around 7%. They're quite fast, quite impressive. But in fact, the value of that number has been seriously hurt by the depreciation, the continuous depreciation of the Indian currency. Since 1994, according to my own calculation, the pace of depreciation averagely per year is around 3% per year since 1994, which means if it keeps that pace, then the real growth rate, if we denominate it by US dollar or euro or just Chinese yuan, is basically like 4% growth rate. Then take into account the expansion of its population, then per capita GDP would be even less growth. So that's what I would like to remind. And here I would like to remind that what makes the currencies stable against the mainstream currencies for the developing countries. The most important thing is not education at all. It's the industry structure, industrialization, and the saving rate. These are really matters. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, next question.
Hi, Dr. Branko, and this is my honor to be here. And also, I've watched a bunch of videos and forums of Professor D through the internet, and some of my university professors quoted Dr. Branko's masterpieces through the courses. So I'm very happy to ask you some questions. And actually, under the current China economic system, the size is large enough to affect globally. So we see the China has a boosting development through the past 4 decades, and also we also see that overall the contribution to the world Gini constant is also have a positive contribution, not a negative one. So I want to say that also as a Chinese student, we study history, and also we found that the inequality gap or income difference also exists. It is existed objectively, not and so so my first question is, you say you just mentioned through your sharing is about like we can have some policies or decisions to reduce the income difference, but also I think I'm sorry because I don't have much research or searching through this topic, but I'm pretty interested in this. So how do we like reduce this gap from a long period? Because we know that as the development following by the time, the gap keeps increasing. So I'm asking for like any possible solutions or possible historical examples for solving these inequalities. Yeah, this is my question. Thank you.
Well, again, excellent question. I have to first before I answer a question, I have to say something about the last point that Professor D mentioned. When I speak about growth rates, I really speak of growth rates in real terms, in goods and services being produced. So when India grew 7%, it was similar to when China grew 7 or 8%, in the sense that they simply produce 7% more of things. Now, if the currency devalues, as Professor D mentioned, the power of India to purchase things out would of course be reduced in that sense, but the production of goods, and that applies the same in Africa in the future, if it grows by 8%, for people would be unchanged. So in other words, 7% or 8% simply means that they have produced 7% more food, they have produced 7% more, I don't know, cars, they have produced 7% more houses, they have produced more cement, iron, electricity, things that you can really touch and see, or services, you go to movies, to the films, to theater, to football games. So that's in real terms, and that of course is very difficult. China is a very special case that was able for 40 years to have a fairly high, very high rate of growth, but it's very difficult for countries even to keep 10 years. And India has been very successful in that, and going to until recently, and going back to the last question, indeed, you can see actually in that slide that I show for China, because China is so big and India is also big. I didn't show the slide for India, but it's very similar. You see that impact on global inequality of individual country. If we were to use some small countries, of course, you would not see it at all because it would not register on the slide. But India and China, and I was saying that also Vietnam, Indonesia, large countries in Asia, and obviously countries like the United States, Japan, Europe have, of course, large impact. And that large impact will be also shown by Africa in the future, simply because it is the part of the world with the largest increase in population. Now, going back directly to the question, what can we do to reduce inequality? This is, of course, something that we do have historical precedents. And for example, the period after World War II in many European countries was a called period of large compression of incomes, and also fairly high growth rate. So we do have the cases where the growth rate did not suffer from a redistribution of income. Now, that redistribution of income, going back to Professor G's point, has to be careful because you don't want to reduce incentives. And of course, I was, as you mentioned, I was, of course, born in a socialist country where the incentives were very much compressed. So you don't want to have incentives so compressed that actually growth suffers. But there is also a point where very high inequality makes people's chances, opportunities so different that actually it really limits possibilities for many poor people. And then at that point, you have inequality having a negative impact on growth. So if I were to define it, I would say it's like this kind of a curve. So if you have very low inequality, you might have very, very low growth, but you might also have very high inequality and low growth. The solution, not an easy solution, is finding something in between, which would enable incentives to exist or coexist with ability of everybody to actually contribute as much and make as much money as possible as well, but contribute as much as possible.
Please, Prof.
Hello. Yeah, I'd like to react a little bit. Actually, Professor Branko Milanovic is right in point out that the real growth is a real growth rate. Normally, for example, Indians 7 or 6%, it's a real growth. The inflation element has already been wiped out. But here I'd like to mention the problem, according to my own research, why the GDP, even if you wipe out the, take into account the inflation thing, it still misleads our, consideration of eliminating poverty, blah, blah. You know, in my own framework of estimating the development or explaining the development, I find in the real world a lot of things have been mixed up and which result in the misunderstanding. For example, the wealth creation in my own framework, I define the tradable goods production as wealth creation, while the non-tradable goods, for example, the haircut service, massage service, that kind of things so far cannot be done online, which means they cannot be exported and imported through boundaries of the nations. Which means, actually, if we have a haircut at Washington Street, Washington DC street, even the very cheap stores, it's around $20. I suppose after this pandemic, it's now maybe $30 ones. Yeah, very simple ones. If in China, in Beijing, for male, it will be $6 or $7 at least. But if we go to Vietnam, even if for Hanoi, it should be $2. Why the price, the added value, when we define it, when we calculate it, even if the Hanoi service provider is really excellent, the best practitioner, the value we calculate is really low, only 10% of the price of the US counterpart. So that's why in the global calculation of wealth, there's a very large part of the miscalculation or misleading or misperception. It's mainly because in the GDP statistics, we put tradable goods and non-tradable goods together. We perceive them same, but in fact, they're totally different. In my own framework, I define tradable goods sector, tradable sector. Most of the manufacturing sectors are agricultural products, and some of them are services. Like today, if we are teaching, if we are cooperating teaching class, now we could teach globally, at the same time. So these services are also tradable goods. They, apply to the same price, one price global rule. But in a lot of economies, like India, like developing countries, or in China or United States, a lot of the economic behaviors or practices, they are in fact not wealth, but distributing the wealth. So that's my definition. I find after changing this definition of the wealth creation or wealth distribution, then a lot of things are much simpler to explain. So that's how I explain why the global periphery, a lot of nations, although they make a lot of efforts, although they received a lot of the assistance from World Bank or from AIIB, they make no fundamental differences. Okay, thank you very much. But by the way, I really appreciate the agreement. I agree with the point. What's the point the point that you mentioned? Sorry, I did not put it down, but I agree a lot that the last sentence that you made. Okay.
Okay, the next question I'll read one question from the chat box. It's for either Professor Milanovic or Professor D. The question is like, I have a question about social mobility. It's about Gaokao. It's a Gaokao. It's policy in China. In order to solve the problem of inequality in different areas, Chinese government provides a different qualified rule, 分数线, for different place. However, I don't think it is a useful way to solve social mobility and education inequality. How can we mitigate the education inequality in China, especially in western part of China? The specific,
It's a very specific question, so I really cannot answer because I don't know it well. But as I was saying before, it seems to me that the problem of geographical inequality, once one understands that it is a problem, it's a problem that is solvable in the sense that you can make incentives. And I know the Chinese government, for example, is making different incentives for different companies to actually go, relocate, invest in the less developed areas. So in that sense, this is not going to, of course, give the result in 1 year, but over a period of time. And I think actually that the reduction of the geographical inequality compared to the way that it was about 10 or 15 years ago is already present in China. So that's why I put it in the 3 solvable problems. I said that they were not easily solvable, but they are solvable. Secondly, it is also being reduced by the movement of people. So once people move, they would, of course, move from the poorer areas into the richer areas, and that would also reduce the difference in mean incomes. So I think both the movement of people, which goes from poor to rich, and the movement of capital, which goes from rich to poor, would actually lead to the reduction of inequality. Something very similar is actually possible at the global scale. If you were to assume free movement of labor and the fact that, of course, money goes from a rich part of the world to the poor part of the world, you would have similar equalization globally. But the problem globally is that we cannot have a free movement of labor because there are many impediments, political, social, and others, that prevent that movement. So we have actually, while within a country, even a large country like China, one works with freedom, technically freedom of labor and capital in the world that does not exist. So that was, I think, instead of having 2 tools, we have only one, and that only tool is movement of capital investments in poorer countries, which would presumably increase the growth rate of those countries and thereby reduce inequality. I cannot now remember what was the previous point that Professor G and I agreed, but I also have to say that, of course, there is a little bit of a difference. That's why I was using, when I compared China and the US and India and Germany, I was using PPP, because PPP assigns the same value to all the goods, whether they are tradable or not tradable. If one were to take, of course, only tradable, then the situation is different. My last point on that is, I think, an interesting point for many students maybe to think about. With the pandemic and with our ability now to communicate like this, many of the jobs that might have been non-tradable and they were difficult to do will now become possible, including, of course, our conversation now. Technically, it was possible 2 years ago, but nobody was doing it. You know, I went to many conferences in the past and the people needed to have money. they have to pay for me to travel there, they have to pay for the office where we are going to meet, they have to pay for the hotel, they have to bring all these people, and then we talk to each other and we learn. You don't need any money. You actually just need to have a Wi-Fi connection, and you would actually bring the same people. So really many of these things have now become possible. And in that sense, there is maybe more of a global labor market now than before the pandemic.
Thank you. Professor D, do you want to talk something about the Gaokao, or that's okay? Okay. Okay. Now the next question, please. Yeah, you can ask the next question.
Okay.
Next
Hi.
question.
Hi, Professor Milanovic, Professor D, and Dr. Xi. This is Belle from Hainan Green Finance Research Institute in Beijing. And I'll be representing our research team based in Beijing to ask the following question. So for a long time, the study of efficiency and equity has been enduring, starting with Adam Smith and Ricardo, all the way to the present. How to strike a better balance between the two may depend more on the direction of national development goals. Globally, there are significant differences between China and other countries in terms of economic system and economic development goals. A great deal of efforts has been made to tackle the inequality issues. By contrast, the Chinese government's policy moves are rare in other countries. From this point of view, China may find a different path in addressing inequality. However, how to replicate China's experience to the rest of the world may also be a completely new topic. So do you have any suggestions or any ideas on this kind of topic?
Well, I have lots of ideas on this topic, but I'm not sure that they're right. So let me I actually have a whole section in my book about that particular problem. Let me put it historically as the question was asked. Historically, when you had very successful countries, and I would say that England first, then the United States, then during one period the Soviet Union, and now in the last 40 years, China. There were two things which happened. Those countries tended to sort of project their system to others, and the others tended to copy that system because they saw that it works well. Actually, it's very obvious with the Industrial Revolution. If you look at England, it spread first to Belgium, the Netherlands, France, then Germany, then Central Europe, then the United States. It's very geographical. Nowadays, we are not so limited by geography, but the same things operate that actually you want to copy something which seems to generate good growth rates and increase income of people and welfare of people. And there we have now two parts. First, is China interested in having its model replicated elsewhere? And secondly, can it be packaged in a way that others would find it easy to apply? And I think there are some issues there, because I think that actually that's my interpretation of the Chinese model. It was evolved really by trial and error. It was not some kind of a great blueprint in 1978, which existed and was then implemented. There were many small parts which were then put together and worked well. Secondly, it combined very well, which is not easy to do. It combined decentralized decision-making in many parts of the countries and different types of enterprises and companies. If you just go back, and of course today we have a whole array from township and village enterprises, state-owned enterprises, public corporate enterprises, private enterprises, foreign private enterprises, lots of them. So that was really very decentralized. On the other hand, certain decisions were centralized. That combination is, in my opinion, very difficult often to replicate elsewhere. And so there are actually both attractiveness of that model and some difficulties in projecting how to do that exactly the way that China did. But I think that the major point that the most successful models tend to attract people who want to copy them and to imitate, which is quite normal. As actually Chinese experience also showed the importance of Japanese and Korean experience previously. It's actually very normal, and that's something that we would expect. But as I said, they're not easily copyable parts of the Chinese experience, in my opinion.
Do you want to talk about this? Okay. Now the next one. Yeah, it's very, very good. There's so many questions. So maybe that's the last one because our time. Maybe that's the last one. Now, please.
It's going to be midnight for me soon. You know.
Yeah. But you said you're a night person, right? Yeah, no problem. The last one, and we're done.
Morning, sir. Can you hear me? I'm a student studying engineering management, and my question is about the variable control in the study of economic inequality. For example, you mentioned that India and China are also countries with huge popular size, but their social system, wealth, and traditional habits are totally different. At the same time, modern China and India are both established at a similar time, and the pace of economic construction is not the same. When we evaluate the development situation according to the statistical data of a certain period of time, it is obvious that many variables are difficult to quantify. And how should we consider these problems? That's my question.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. What is difficult to quantify? Just one.
The variable control about this study.
You know, I understood the first part of the question, and when you study global inequality, there are two elements which really influence the role of the country: the size of population and also the income of the population. So clearly China and India, particularly now, if you look at the size of population, they have now come to a situation where the two countries have exactly the same, practically the same size. And China, of course, is richer, so it actually influences global inequality more because it is simply like a larger, in physics, larger mass overall. But both China and India are extremely important. When you go back historically, obviously when we talk about inequality and global inequality and GDP and all that, we abstract from many differences, which are historical, cultural, religious, graphic, whatever. So we don't deal with that. And when it comes to historical numbers, they are, of course, I have to say, very difficult, and we have very few of them. I can, for example, speak of the numbers about Chinese inequality. We have really very few in the past, but I have to say that there is lots of economic history advance now. And I've seen, of course, Chinese authors working on archival data, because China is in that sense very lucky because it has obviously old civilization and government structure, which has remained, so that archival data are there. And for many, I think, young students, I think it's very interesting challenge actually to work on this archival data. And the work that I've used from, obviously from sources of people who have done that work for inequality comes from such, compendiums of data by social groups and by what is called social tables, social groups and their estimated average incomes. And that comes from archival sources. So this is actually our source. If I understood the question correctly, but that was the source for the historical data in countries like China and India and other countries as well. But of course, for China and India was specifically the question.
Okay, that's pretty much everything. We still have a lot of materials to digest. So thanks Professor Branko Milanovic. Thanks, Professor D. We may have future talks if you guys are interested. It's an exciting talk. It's especially the discussion part. Okay, that's pretty much the plan for today. You guys can feel free to leave, and we will post the video to the public. I think it's and the associated materials like some summaries in Chinese, because still we need to caption it and translate it. We want to let more and more Chinese economists and even people working in government to understand what you guys understand your the different kind of thought, Eastern and Western economists on China's inequality problem and the socioeconomic structure. So that's it. That's it for you. Thank you so much.
Just would like to thank all the students, because I saw that on chat, many of them saying thank you. So I would like to thank you. I would like to thank Zhuo Shi for inviting me, and Professor D for excellent comments. So I hope next time we can meet in person.
Yeah, definitely. Especially after this pandemic, welcome to China. Welcome to Hainan Green Finance Institute, and also to the University of China. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone.